Hello, Apes World. Mrs. Girardi here, digging into section 3 of coal, petroleum, and natural gas. So, the overarching ideas that we're going to look at is how do we extract the fossil fuel from Earth? What are the consequences? And then, what are some advantages and disadvantages to each of the three different? This one's going to focus just on coal. So, we talked about fossil fuel formation in class already, that it is due to dead plants in old swamps and trees that got buried over time, and due to pressure and heat, all of those carbon bonds that existed in the plants rearranged themselves into coal. And so, if we see here, based on the depth and the time, so how many layers are on top of them, how much pressure they're under, and for how long they're under said pressure and heat, you can have three different types of coal. So for coal, we're going to consider lignite, bituminous, and anthracite coal. Peat is kind of a precursor to coal, but definitely not coal. So if we look at peat, you have a lot of developing parts of the world that still use peat as kind of their subsistence energy. And so this is partially decomposed matter under anaerobic conditions. So it's very wet, and you would actually need to dry it out before you could combust it or burn it for heat. And so over time, with more sediment layers, you can form what's called lignite coal. And so that's considered brown coal. It has a low sulfur content. It has a low heat capacity. So it's not going to burn as hot because of all that moisture. And sometimes you can even see traces of ferns and things like that. Bituminous coal is found deeper, and this is considered soft coal. It's very common. It has less water content. It's the most commonly used. We find it all over the Appalachian Mountains, so think West Virginia and the coal mining. It has a higher heat capacity than lignite, but it actually has a higher sulfur content. And sulfur, like we talked about in class, is something that can turn into acid precipitation and have negative effects on the environment. The increased pressure and deeper burial, so longer time here, 280 to 360 million years ago, you get the coal that I had in class, that anthracite, thick, hard coal. This has a very low sulfur content. It has the highest heat capacity, so it's going to burn. You're going to get the most heat during combustion from burning it. It's also the most expensive. So, kind of some positives and negatives. This chart is just a good summary of what we talked about. So you can see increased heat and pressure. You go from peat to lignite to bituminous to anthracite coal. And then again, it just talks a little bit about sulfur content and water content. So you have less water as you move over due to that extra heat and pressure. So this forms that really hard, expensive, high heat capacity anthracite coal. This I just thought was kind of a neat look at the chemistry of forming coal. So you can go from just kind of your bark, your wood, your cellulose, your cell wall, all the way down to anthracite and see what a high percent of carbon. So that's why it gets such a high heat capacity. And then you can tell that you're removing that oxygen, right? So you're removing all the water. This is just kind of a recap of what we talked about with our mining unit. So coal exists in what's called coal seams. So here we see that brown lignite coal seam. And so typically here we do strip mining, which is a type of surface mining. And again, just kind of reviewing some vocab, you remove the overburden to get to that coal seam, and then you'd move on to the parallel layer of earth and do the same thing. We used to do a considerable amount of deep mining for coal, but considering it's very dangerous, that has actually become less and less common. You're not going to have any of this be on the quiz, environmental impacts in mining. This was just a Ms. Girardi chance to do review. So obviously habitat destruction and habitat loss. This is clearly not the same habitat it was before we started the coal mining. All the sedimentation that can get carried off in water and end up in rivers and lakes. Acid mine drainage. If you have a lot of heavy precipitation, you now have sulfur that's exposed that used to be buried. And then just think about those mine tailings, which also have high concentrations of arsenic, mercury, and lead. If those mine tailings aren't held properly, that can obviously put a lot of negative things into the environment. This is kind of for you to peruse through. You definitely don't need me to read through advantages and disadvantages, but coal was the first fossil fuel because it was the easy access, led it to be the cheapest. We also have a tremendous amount of coal in the United States. So we even do things called coal to liquid and coal to gas, where we take the coal and we convert it into a liquid that we can use like petroleum so that we're less dependent on foreign countries for petroleum. And to get to that process, you actually have to gasify it first and then cool it down to a liquid. So I'll let you peruse these. Again, you don't need me to read them. Thanks for listening.